So the big bad Primaris battle tank has seen a points drop, but is it enough to make it the gun platform of choice in the Space Marine Codex? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines and we're doing a bit of a datasheet review of the Gladiator tanks, who I think made themselves deserving of a fresh look, seeing as they went down in points cost by a fair bit in the new chapter approved field manual. The Gladiator is one of the more relatively recent Primaris vehicles, coming out at the start of 9th edition, and since it dropped it's kind of been okay, but heavily outclassed by other options within the codex. In 9th edition in particular, gun units do have to be just very efficient. If they're not particularly well suited to the front line and taking objectives, then it means they're really going to have to make their presence felt in a big way, otherwise you're going to be taking more units that can both shoot and also fight in combat. That basically meant that for Space Marine gun platforms, things like the Volkite Contemptor Dreadnought and the Redemptor Dreadnought were generally the go-to options, but now with both of those seeing a points nerf and the Gladiator receiving a small buff, I thought it might be worth going over the datasheets once more and looking at a few numbers comparing them. In the video then we'll look at each of the 3 datasheets, any obvious buffs and synergies that you can put with them to make them even stronger, talk a bit about their damage output for the points, and then compare them to the mighty Redemptor. Plenty to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up we have the Gladiator Valiant, which following the new chapter approved has dropped down to 215 points now, and this one's the close range anti-tank mauler out of the Gladiators. Gladiator tanks in general do have a fairly respectable tank profile, basically a Space Marine heavy tank with 10-inch movement, strength 7, toughness 8, a big 12 wounds and a 3+ save with no invul. They hit on 3s, and as they degrade, their movement, ballistic skill and attacks get worse. In general they're a fairly fast gun platform, though I must admit with 9th edition's lethal anti-tank weapons, toughness 8 and 12 wounds really wasn't what it was a while back. I would still consider them at least relatively fragile for the points cost, and more of a hard-hitting damage dealer than a unit that's really all that great at taking damage. In any case, each of the Gladiator variants packs a couple of sponsor weapons, a turret weapon, and then a couple of generic extra options. As they're common to all 3 units, the extra options are to take an Iron Hail Heavy Stubber and an Icarus Rocket Pot. It can take both of those and they cost 5 points each. I think usually for the extra 10 points invested, I would usually do so. Sure, they are putting a few more eggs in one already fragile basket, but even if those things fire once, they've got a very reasonable chance of making back any points invested, let alone if they fire multiple times. You can also take auto launches as well for 5 points. That one gives you the smokescreen keyword, so you can expend 1 command point for -1 to hit. I think that might be something that I'd be tempted to do if I did have just the one Gladiator in the list. Then you could guarantee that you get the -1 to hit on your tank if you need it. I might be a bit less bothered though if I was spamming 3 of them, as you can only use the stratagem on 1 tank per turn anyway, so you increase the chance of kind of wasting a few points. In any case, to turn our attention back to the Valiant itself, this thing is just all anti-tank shots, firing out 4 twin Last Helen shots at strength 9, AP -3, damage D6, and 2 sets of 2 multi-melter shots, again at 24 inches. I'd say that the damage output for 215 points is actually fairly impressive now, though I would bear in mind that it does have to get by entirely on its own merit, as it's not a core unit, so you can't get rerolls and things from captains. We'll look at its damage output in a bit, but overall I'd say it's really quite hard hitting for the cost. Even if it is obviously a little bit short ranged, you do run the risk of your opponent being able to outrange it for a turn, which could be pretty crucial. In any case, otherwise for special rules you have Angels of Death for things like combat doctrines, and the hover tank and explode rules. You also have the repulsor keyword stratagem, which does allow you a handy anti-charge stratagem that again we'll come on to. Moving on to the Valiant's lesser impressive cousin in my opinion, we have the Gladiator Lancer. This one's 165 points now, again dropping 15 from previously, and to be honest this one is getting to the point where its durability isn't too bad for the cost at all. Particularly with its longer range weapons, it can afford to sit back just that bit more. I'd say it might be the best looking out of the tanks potentially. That Lancer Laser Destroyer does look quite imposing. A big 72-inch range, heavy 2, strength 10, AP -3, and damage D3 +3. What's more, it does have a quill on optics, so it hits on a 2+, though even with the long range and reliable damage output, this thing just doesn't really hold much of a candle to the Valiant with those big 8 anti-tank shots. For secondary weapons, it either has a pair of Storm Bolters or a pair of Fragstorm grenade launchers. Not bad to chip in a little bit of extra small arms, but they're not usually going to be changing the world. Again, we'll compare its damage output to the Valiant in a bit. Finally, we have the Gladiator Reaper. This one almost feels like the Baal Predator of the Primaris world. It recently drops down to 195 points from 210, and this one's the anti-infantry Gatling version with a massive great big twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon at 24 shots, strength 6, AP -1, and a 30-inch range. As if that weren't enough, it then doubles down on that with a Tempest Bolter, 30-inch range and rapid fire 4, strength 4, AP -1, damage 1. If you do load it up with the Iron Hail Heavy Stubber and the Icarus Rocket Pod on top of that, you're normally going to be kicking out a very impressive 38 shots all the way out to 24-inch range, and an extra 8 more on top of that if you happen to get within 15-inch rapid fire range. This thing's still going to be fairly underwhelming against heavy armor, particularly anything with good saves, but it's absolutely going to shred light infantry like there is no tomorrow. That heavy onslaught Gatling cannon is the absolute bane of toughness 5 orcs at the moment. Even without any buffs or anything, you could easily be picking up 10 models per turn just with that one burst of fire. As I mentioned, not having the core keyword does kind of hold back the gladiators in terms of any buffs or synergy with other units, but they do still have a few interesting options. In particular, non-core vehicles like the gladiators tend to have really quite good synergy with the Iron Hand. They've got a lot going on to make vehicles like this a lot more efficient. Even at base they have their Feel No Pain type save, slower degrading of the profile, and really quite a nice unique Devastator doctrine for re-rolling ones to hit. Their character and stratagem support though can really amp this up further, giving it a bonus to its save or +1 to hit from the psychic. The Ironstone is a great relic for an extra -1 damage that makes it feel like it's a dreadnought, and good stratagems like easy access to returning to the Devastator doctrine, that's particularly relevant for the Reaper. Otherwise, most of the other chapters do have at least some role for it. Raven Guard can grant it cover at long range, which doesn't hurt. Imperial Fists get to ignore cover, Dark Angels get +1 to hit when they're stationary, Black Templars get a 5+ invul save from their Vow, and potentially can even tag a multi-melter on top if you really want even more anti-tank shots. Ultramarines can redeploy them and fall back and shoot without having to use the stratagem, and Salamanders will get on pretty well with the Valiant, having their single wound reroll plus the multi-melter buff. Just generally though, Tech Marines can give you a +1 to hit and healing the vehicle. They seem like a pretty reasonable HQ choice to include if you are taking a couple of these, or these alongside some Dreadnoughts or something. And I guess in theory you could use a Librarian for Psychic Fortress as well, giving them a 5+ invul, though it's a bit sad if they get gunned down turn 1 before the Librarian even gets a chance to cast this. Finally, stratagem wise from the core codex, there's 1 command point for Armour of Contempt for the 5+ Feel No Pain against mortal wounds. Situationally helpful, that one. 1 command point for Grav Pulse, which has a couple of good uses. It can make enemies -2 to charge, or allow you to fall back and shoot. Both of those are very good things for a tank, I think. And 1 command point for Smokescreen if you've chosen to include the auto launchers. All of those seem reasonable. The Grav Pulse I think is particularly helpful, and helps get over one of the major weaknesses of tanks in 9th. A little bit of damage and durability now then. Just in general, the toughness 8 and 12 wounds can be tough. Generally it will be against anything that's strength 7 or lower, but against true anti-tank it's not going to make that much difference. It only on average takes around 6 las cannon hits or 5 dark lance hits to kill one of these tanks, and they can also be surprisingly fragile to things like heavy bolters as well. Mass strength 5 shooting wounding on 5s with 2 damage will whittle these down pretty quickly. In general I think in game you do want to try and keep them hidden wherever possible, certainly turn 1 if you can, and then use that decent 10-inch movement to hopefully get a line of sight. Damage wise, for a bit of comparing profiles, the Lancer's main gun will usually average you around about 4 or 5 wounds to a standard toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, that is accounting for the Aquilon optics as well, and it works out to about 2.8 wounds per 100 points. On the other hand, the more expensive Valiant, that averages you around about 11 or 12 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, around about 10 to a toughness 8 vehicle. When accounting for points it's around about 5 wounds per 100 points, so does almost twice the damage. It is of course shorter range and you get less wounds of tank for the points, but if the opponent's very bold and you do manage to get this thing in melter range, then you get even more damage than here. In general I do feel that the Valiant is a better anti-tank choice over the Lancer right now. The Lancer's vaguely annoying but maybe just feels like a threat that you don't really have to deal with that urgently, but it's kind of impossible to ignore a big 8 anti-tank shots slamming into your army each turn. Certainly not really competing for the same role, but if you do go for a big multi-shot Gladiator Reaper, say you upgrade it with the Stubber for a 200 point unit, that'll average around about 14 wounds to Guardsmen, 3 or 4 dead Space Marines with 2 wounds, or about 4 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. Again a little bit more if you do happen to get those Tempest Bolters in half range. Really though, I think one of the main questions for whether or not they actually get played in competitive lists is whether or not the Gladiators actually beat the Redemptor now. The Redemptor's long been the gun platform of choice for the Space Marines, as not only does it shoot just about as well as the Gladiators, but it also has core so you can get rerolls for it. Duty Eternal makes it tougher against a lot of weapons, and of course it's a Dreadnought so it can punch you pretty hard in combat as well as shoot. They've just been a generic go-to Space Marine powerhouse unit for quite a lot of 9th. Now perhaps the most standard version of the Redemptor with the Icarus pod and Onslaught cannon, that's gone up to 195 points. Of course it certainly still has all those same advantages, and if you math out its durability, I still think that in general the Redemptor is usually going to be a bit tougher for the points against most anti-tank weapons. On average, a Gladiator takes around about 6 las cannons or 5 dark lances to bring down. The Redemptor's more like 8 or 9 las cannons, 5 dark lances, the same there, and really quite a lot better against anything that's damage 3 or damage 2, where the -1 damage really comes into effect. I think in general I'd usually say that the Redemptor is tougher than the 2 variants of the Gladiator that I'm most interested in, the Reaper and the Valiant. For damage output though, just on raw stats, not accounting for core buffs, the Redemptor is kind of beat by the Gladiators. The 195 point model does 6 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or about 3.2 to a toughness 8 vehicle, whereas say the Valiant at a slightly more expensive cost with an Icarus pod and stubber, that does around about 12 or 13 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or around about 6.2 to something like a Plague Burst Crawler with toughness 8, a 5+ invul and -1 damage. Admittedly though, the Redemptor is a bit more anti-infantry focused. It does pack a pair of Storm Bolters and that Onslaught Gatling cannon, so it is going to be putting more shots into infantry than the Valiant. Overall, I think they're fairly balanced against medium infantry, things like Space Marines, but the Redemptor pulls ahead against light infantry, things like Guardsmen. It is quite nice though that the Valiant does appear to have a pretty decent niche against armour now. It really is solidly better than the Redemptor for that role, to the extent where even if you paid additional points cost for a captain and a lieutenant, it still wouldn't catch up just for the one model. Even so though, being a bit tougher and fighting in melee well are 2 pretty decent advantages anyway. If you compare the Reaper version of the Gladiator to the Redemptor with the Onslaught cannon, again just for pure damage output, the Reaper does win by a fair bit. It kills around about 17 Guardsmen or 4 dead Marines, compared with the Onslaught Redemptor's 11 Guardsmen or 2 or 3 dead Marines. That one maybe seems a little bit more equivocal though. If you do have a captain or lieutenant around and maybe pop Wisdom of the Ancients, the Redemptor really isn't going to be that far behind at all, and again has the Duty Eternal and the fighting in melee buffs. So overall, I'd say maybe as a general purpose unit, perhaps the Redemptor is still slightly nosing ahead, but depending on what you're actually using for, the Gladiators still are decent. If you're looking just for pure firepower and nothing else, these guys will generally do better, and sometimes it is quite nice for a unit that you don't actually have to support or babysit, and is kind of happy just wandering around doing its own thing, and a little bit faster than the Redemptor at that. Overall though, if you do have any Gladiator tanks, they've certainly been given a new lease of life. It's quite cool to see these new shiny models actually have a semi-decent chance of competing for the top spot, even if they still have their drawbacks. Let me know what you think of them anyway. Are they going to be worth considering for you? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I will certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Hopefully we'll have a fair bit more for the Space Marines to come. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Making all these videos does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you're enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.